Hello and welcome to this webinar. It's a Washington, D.C. update on federal government policy developments from the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. This is a One Voice webinar, and it's brought to you by your team at Bracewell. I'm Caitlin Sickles here at Bracewell. On the webinar today is Paul Nathanson, also from Bracewell, and your team from the Franklin Partnership. That's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. As folks who regularly join these webinars know, the Bracewell team does communications and advocacy messaging for One Voice, and the Franklin Partnership does the on-the-ground lobbying, meeting with members of Congress, policymakers, and regulators, as well as members from the administration, to advance the voices of small and medium-sized manufacturers across the country. We have been doing these webinars since the year 2020. We started at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've been bringing these webinars at varying frequencies since then for updates on what's happening in the federal government and how that impacts manufacturers across the country. You can find the recording of today's webinar, as well as a number of resources mentioned on the webinar, and the recordings of all previous webinars online. You can find it at onevoiceinfo.org. It's onevoiceinfo.org. There's much to cover on today's webinar. While Congress is in recess now, home for the August recess, they were very active at the beginning of the month, as most people know. We can talk about the climate, healthcare, and tax law that was signed earlier this month. We'll also give an update on the CHIPS bill. We'll talk a little bit about tariffs. For folks who have been following that issue, you'll know that that One Voice members are founding members of CAMU, which is a coalition dedicated to raising awareness about the impact of tariffs on the manufacturing sector. We had One Voice members testify before the ITC and then submit supplemental comments this week, so we can talk about that as well. But we will begin with an update where we usually begin on regulatory actions related to COVID, as well as the emerging monkeypox virus. So I will turn it over now to John Guzik with the Franklin Partnership to talk about what's going on with COVID regulatory actions. John?
Well, thanks, Caitlin. And I also want to encourage all of you, if you have a question during this webinar, we're going to save time at the end of the webinar for you to type in any questions. But if you have a question, feel free to type it in during the presentation. And if we have time, we'll be able to address it as it comes up. So since our last webinar a month ago, the CDC has come up with a number of guidances and advisories. The first one is, when do you isolate? Well, when you're not feeling well. If you have a fever, if you have COVID symptoms, that is when you isolate. Then they went further down into more details of, after you're feeling better, you still have to isolate for 10 days. And they gave us some guidance on that. Is if you're feeling better, you don't have to, you can leave isolation after 5 days, but you still must wear a mask for 10 days. However, they gave you an option: wear a mask for 10 days, or if you have 2 consecutive sequential COVID tests, negative tests, antigen tests, that you don't have to necessarily wear a mask 10 days. You can wear a mask for under 5 days. They did do a note of caution that if there's a positive test while in that 10-day process, you've got to start the process over, and that may take longer than 10 days. Then they tell you, how to count 10 days. Well, they said, they made a clarification here. Day 1 is not the day of symptoms. Day 0 is the day of symptoms. Day 1 of isolation is a day after you receive symptoms. And so this next page highlights some of those details that they talk about. And then if you get a positive test, how do you restart the process? And they lay out, wear a mask, wait 4 to 8 hours after your symptoms occur, take the test. If you get 2 sequential tests, you're good, but you still have to wear masks, or unless you take the antigen tests. Then they made some recommendations If you test positive, stay home, makes sense, for at least 5 days, because you're most infectious in the first 5 days. If after 5 days your symptoms, no fever, no symptoms, you don't have to, you can end your isolation, but they encourage you to stay away from others and continue wearing a mask till day 10, and stay away from people till day 11. Then this next chart is for those who are visual learners, a flow chart of what to do in certain circumstances when you have COVID. The next 2 slides show that. And then in the typical CDC fashion that we have seen throughout COVID, when they sent out notices and such, they've done some animation, and here are some simple animation of what activities put you at low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. Not a surprise if you sing in a choir, you are in the high risk. You are in a high risk category. So.
Yeah, I think, John, you're right. Those are helpful as you go along those lines, and especially as you think to some of these, the flow chart, is that something that we should hand over to the HR department? Those are some of the things I think that for this slide deck purposes, to your point, John, I think would be helpful to do. But go ahead.
Yeah. So then OSHA came out with some updates, some OSHA updates as well. And this first slide shows what dates the OSHA has given out updates. The second slide shows what were the specific updates for manufacturers, seafood processors, food processors and stuff. And it's not news to One Voice members, because we've been talking about it for 2 years. Making sure your facility is ventilated, working 6 feet apart. Don't have people working directly across from each other. If you can't work 6 feet apart, put up quality barriers that cannot easily flap in the wind and can easily be torn down. So that was their recommendation. And then going back to CDC, we're hearing more and more in the news media about monkeypox. If any of your employees or customers and such have been exposed to monkeypox, CDC in the next 2 slides give you some guidance on what to do in those situations. Again, it's best you hand these over to your HR department. But Omar, the big news is the passage and the signing of the law of the CHIPS Plus bill and the climate, healthcare, and tax bill.
Yeah, that's right, John. And let's just start at the top here in the climate bill, and let's also frame where this is. This used to be the Build Back Better. What was it? 3.7 trillion, then 3.2, then 2.2 trillion, then 1.9 trillion. And this was the bill that last year increased taxes on a number of pass-through businesses, C corporations, addressed the estate tax, and a whole host of other things that we fought to successfully defeat. And eventually we killed that bill just around the Thanksgiving and Christmas time. So that was definitely a win on that side. However, we always expected that at some point, Democrats, particularly in the Senate, would come back and try to push forward with some kind of legislation that they could take back to their constituencies, particularly in the climate space, and of course, with some of the Affordable Care Act fixes that they needed to do. And we'll talk about how they paid for it on the next slide. But this climate change bill, energy bill, however you'd like to call it, is pretty significant. Again, it was done with the reconciliation process. That means that only 50 Senate Democrats had to go along, same as Republican used the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, similar under reconciliation. This climate bill, though, how did it actually happen? I mean, they've been talking about this for decades, and not just Democrats. We had McCain, Lindsey Graham, yes, that Lindsey Graham, and Joe Lieberman, and a number of folks go toe-to-toe over the years with a lot of folks in each of their parties saying this is something we can do. But what they did over the years was more of a stick approach. And this isn't necessarily factual. This is more of just my analysis, at least, and give you a sense of how did Democrats actually get to this point, and how come business, yes, they were upset about many of the tax provisions, but even oil and gas folks didn't have a whole lot to really scream about in this bill compared to the previous legislation, not just last year, but in previous years. And that's because there's a lot more incentives in this legislation for them to meet targets outside of the methane emissions. So there's a fee on that one of about $1,500, but vast majority of the provisions in here, as you'll see, are going to be more along the lines of tax credits and incentives. And then ultimately, progressives had to concede to allowing more oil and gas leases to be permitted to move forward here on inland drilling. And that was another area that we saw this able to come through. And there's another round. There's going to be a bill that also prescribes how quickly some of these leases can move forward, is what Manchin was promised by Schumer. We'll see if that happened. But this is definitely significant legislation. It impacts a lot of the electric sector, energy sector, manufacturing sector. This gives you a snapshot of the amount of dollars that it raises here. The 15% corporate minimum tax that we'll talk about, there's some fluctuations, but just call it's somewhere around $200 billion in new net revenue. And then the IRS enforcement, that's numbers, that's how much they generate, they believe, based on putting in as much as they are and towards new not just enforcement, but also new online and customer service, as they so call it, loss limitations. And then the other side is how much they're spending. And, you know, obviously some of them are calling this the Inflation Reduction Act. But John, that's not necessarily something that we will put a label on it. As of right now, it's the Climate Healthcare Tax Reconciliation Bill. But as you can see, there's quite a bit in here on electric vehicle provisions. And, you know, I'll ask Paul here to jump in the next slide or so to put some of this in context. But as you'll see, this is a lot more of the carrot approach. We'll talk about California and the stick approach in a minute. But John, do you want to jump in here on the $7,500 credit is divided into two parts, or Paul, if you want to actually go in here onto this one on critical minerals and batteries. Jump in.
Well, let me start and then I'll hand it off to Paul. So there's a $7,500 credit for passenger vehicles that are under $55,000 in value, trucks, vans, and SUVs. The credit caps at vehicles under $80,000. So also, if you make over $150,000 as an individual or $300,000 as a married couple, you're no longer eligible for the credit. And importantly, and where this is really going to expand electric vehicle production, is it eliminates, there was a 200,000 vehicle production cap in place prior to the passage of this legislation. And what this legislation does is it does eliminate the OEM production cap. So it takes effect for vehicles put in service after December 31st of this year, and it lasts till 2032. Used cars that go into service after 12/31 must be older than 2 years old. They would be eligible for a $4,000 credit, but I still believe the income limits apply to them as well.
Yeah, but Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to add, you know, I think the EV makers are glad that something that, you know, these tax credits were included. However, 70% of the automakers say that they're not going to qualify right now, and that critical minerals piece is very important because, and obviously the battery components assembly requirement. You know, the minerals that make that we use to make the batteries, they tend to come from bad places, and the restrictions that are placed on what critical minerals qualify for that you have to use to qualify for the tax credit is pretty strict. You know, it's supposed to incentivize production in the U.S. and also require that you only source them from countries that where the U.S. has good trade relations. It pretty much knocks out sourcing these from China and other places, and we don't have a good replacement yet for all these critical minerals that are needed. You know, Bracewell represents a company that's trying to get these critical minerals from the ocean floor, which has vast quantities. However, you know, there are a lot of environmental groups that are opposed to it. So it's going to be a real question of how many of these vehicles are going to qualify, because these are very tight restrictions that they have placed on what EVs qualify because of this critical minerals and also assembling in the US component.
Yeah, and that's it. And part of the critical minerals on the battery one, that's obviously the target is China here, because it says if we have an FTA, if we have another agreement with them, then we're allowed to source up until a certain time. But then the ultimate trigger is the final assembly must still be made in North America with, guess what? Canada and Mexico came out and saying, okay, no problem. We're now okay. After last year, they joined a letter with South Korea and the European Union saying that they were concerned about the provision included in that Democrat bill that failed last fall. Now, from a trade standpoint, there is, and they do have a trade case here in terms of the European Union and South Korea. The question is, do they pursue it at the WTO, and to what extent? Are they going to try to do retaliation because it provides a discriminatory practice which violates the WTO rules? And are they going to go forward with an actual case? Are they just going to try to extract some kind of a concession down the line? USTR here in Washington doesn't seem to care too much that the Europeans and South Koreans have raised an objection. So as of now, we do believe that this is in. We don't see this coming out. It is now law and is in effect for cars that are put in service starting on January 1st. And as John mentioned, the used vehicles, at least 2-year-old credit does stay in there. The Department of Energy, we didn't put a link to this, but either you can hit your Google machine or we can send it out later. But the Department of Energy last Wednesday did put out a list of all the eligible vehicles that will be considered assembled in North America for the year 2022/23. So that information is already out there. We thought here on this middle bullet, we would give you some samples of vehicles that are eliminated for not being assembled in North America, including some BMW, some Hyundai, a Toyota model. But they did note here that if you are already in a binding contract, you still are eligible for the one that was out there until the president signed into law. There's a number of other things out there on battery production and domestic electric vehicle conversion grants in terms of retooling existing automotive facilities. They're going to increase the use of the Defense Production Act. As you can see, to Paul's point, for critical mineral processing available until September 30th, 24. See how that aligns with that 2025 data. And this next slide here, and I'll hand it over to John, will kind of give you a little snapshot of some of the $7,500 restrictions and how that breaks down. To Paul's point, China really is the focus there.
Yeah, and this expands the Domestic Defense Production Act. And to Paul's point about critical minerals, in the infrastructure bill that the Congress passed, 2 months ago, it seems like forever, they did include an additional $7 billion for electric vehicle battery production. And that is where the critical mineral issue comes into place. And so to Paul's point, we are, and as the next slide shows, projections are a rapid increase in electric vehicles, but that's provided that we have the necessary critical minerals to put those vehicles into service.
So from here, what our hope is, we're not the economists, you all are the industry experts. We defer to the NTMA and the PMA as you all look at your fall conference lineup and next year and just getting your experts. What does this impact of this new legislation have on tooling, on molds, on machining, on stampings? You all obviously have been involved in these industries for quite some time, but now projecting forward for the next several years, we've just run through a few examples here of the government investment and expectations that are coming out just from the federal level. And what does that do? And potentially what opportunities and also what pitfalls do we now need to factor in? Again, you see that there's a lot of carrot approaches in here. There's a lot of opportunities, especially those that, on the CFO side might want to start getting together with your tax specialists and your CPAs in the coming months to identify, is there a way that we can benefit, whether it's electric vehicles or some other area or charging stations, what can we do on our facilities and retrofitting that can align from there? And as you take a look now, we just talked about the carrot approach. We'll now give you the opposite. Welcome to California. A few of our friends that are on this call, the reason we mentioned California is I think now the total is when you factor in the other 3 states that did on, there's 17 states that will follow California's rule. California has an exemption that allows it to set its own emission standards as long as they are at least as strict, or rather stricter than the federal guidelines, in which they now have. So they are voting, or they probably have by now, voted to mandate that to get rid of all new sales of gas-powered vehicles by the year 2035. And this chart shows you of where they want to go. The doubling, what that means at 35% is because right now they're at about 15% is the total sales in the first half of this calendar year of electric vehicles in the state of California, with hybrids making up another 2.9% of sales in the first half. And that's why they project that they want to see a doubling. But in 3 years, that is still quite ambitious when you look at it from a production standpoint. However, on the top part of it, you can get a sense of where some of the OEMs are already indicating that they'd like to be. Please note, especially for aftermarket, that used sales are going to be permitted of gas-powered vehicles beyond the 2035 deadline, and then also hybrids will still have a place to play apparently in what they call the zero emissions, what they try to get towards on valuation. So let's just give you a couple overviews right there. But John, as we go back to we'll run through a few of them here, some of the details on what some of these more of the carrot side are from the federal level, as we just quickly jump back to what was from California, and here we are back to the federal level.
Yeah, and there's a lot of credits and opportunities and incentives, as you touched on, whether you're dealing with looking at, I mean, you talked about charging stations and stuff, whether you want to put solar into your facility, the old solar, the credits for renewables, credits for nuclear energy, hydro. And so there's a number of opportunities out there, again, depending on where you're located, to take advantage of some of the credits out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And these next few slides will just show you a quick sampling of what are on there. On the left, obviously, that's for individuals. But even on clean vehicles, there's a couple of things that we would suggest that you also discuss with your CPAs at some point when you get involved in it. 2 tax credits under the new IRC 45. One of them is an extension, another one's a creation under 45X. So what they do is you'll look over on the right side in the qualified commercial clean vehicles. That's the section 45W credit for that, and that will create that new section to create a new credit for qualified commercial clean vehicles that are acquired prior to 2033. So that gives you the amount of time that can be there, and the credit can be the lesser of either 30% of the basis of the vehicle, that is the electric vehicle, or the incremental cost of that vehicle. And then it cannot exceed $7,500 though for vehicles weighing less than 14,000 pounds, and $40,000 for other vehicles. Again, that's 45W, and that is the section 13403. Also in the bottom right is section 13404, and that's the new section 45. That one is also one that you could potentially look at for refueling stations and something along those lines that could be helpful there. Just a couple more here on the top left on the investment in clean energy and manufacturing energy security. The 13502 in the bottom left, the advanced manufacturing production credit. This is probably going to be some areas where it could benefit a narrow focus of our member companies. This is going to be under the new section created called 45X, the advanced manufacturing production credit, that looks at components that are produced and sold that deal with solar and other areas, wind energy components, and also an inverter, a number of other things, qualifying battery components, photovoltaic wafers, solar grade, other things in cells, and those solar energy components. So there might be a few of our members that could look at that, getting that credit of 50% for eligible components sold in certain years, 75 in other years, and it scales down over time. So that's something else to take a look at over time there. But Paul, I know your shop has also been looking at quite a bit of the number of the other provisions here. This one just kind of talks about general ones that are home, but I know you guys are putting out quite a bit of stuff over at Bracewell.
Yeah, offshore wind, hydrogen, those are big winners in this. And I know that that part of the renewables sector is very, are excited about the passage of the bill and should create a boost. As you know, particularly on the East Coast, offshore wind, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, even North Carolina have all made big commitments to converting from oil and gas to renewables, particularly offshore wind, and this provides a boost, as well as the production of hydrogen and the use of hydrogen in the energy transition. So we've been tracking this closely, and I'm happy to provide additional analysis for those who are interested. But it is a big boost for renewables, and particularly, as I said, hydrogen, offshore wind, and solar are big winners. And our tax guys have been working on this for a long time.
And at those, homeowners, there's the extended 10-year rooftop solar credit, which extends the credit for 10 years to 30% credit. But this time the bill includes a credit for batteries. And there's also rebates and incentives for purchasing energy efficient appliances in the home, including heat pumps and electric stoves and dryers and circuit breaker boxes. So whether it's the corporate, the business, the environmentalists, and even homeowners. There's something in there for everybody in this legislation.
Yeah, there is a couple of, and we'll answer a couple of questions here that have come in a minute, but John, do you just want to go ahead and jump right in on some of the taxes and we can kind of go from there?
Some of the taxes, yes. So there's 1% excise tax on stock buybacks. That was a critical insistence from, I think it was Senator Sinema in Arizona on that. And then there was, we've touched on earlier, there was a 15% corporate minimum alternative tax for those companies who were reporting profits over $1 billion over a 3-year period. So those are two of the major provisions out there. They do extend the pass-through business liability as well. So those are some of the major revenue providers in this legislation. The 15% corporate minimum tax, as Omar mentioned earlier, the business community, it really only impacts 200 businesses across the United States, and so that's why many of them were not up in arms as this legislation was moving forward.
Yeah, again, because we were expecting so much worse, and we obviously were fighting it. We were able to make some changes. We obviously, when it comes to OEMs, if they're going to pay more taxes, they'll have fewer resources to invest in research in our industries, and that's part of the reason why there was a lot of fighting back on that and pushback. But they also did ultimately allow for that 15% minimum rate that we'll touch on here in more details, but they did allow for you to use general business tax deductions or credit deductions. And so the R&D, depreciation, all of those can still allow you to go below that 15%. And then the other one, as John mentioned, for the pass-through limitation limits for the NOL, that's an extension from that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What happened is the ARPA was suspended for 2 years because of COVID. And then they went ahead and Democrats then extended the NOL provision for another year during the ARPA, and then they extended it now for another 2 years so basically went from 2025 to 2028, and that's how that loss limitation stayed in there. It was basically an extension. That's not necessarily new. But to John's point, here's just a sample from our standpoint of some of those businesses that are going to be affected based on their previous years of looking at their tax rates of what they're paying. And again, this goes on the reported book income that they're reporting out to shareholders. Just for those that are on the phone, a quick couple of them: Intel paying 9.6%, General Motors 7.3%, TI's at 12%, Ford 9.9%. On the defense side, Northrop Grumman's 12.7%, and then Johnson Controls back on the automotive 10.8%, Xcel Energy 0%, AMD 0.7%. A lot of those that are paying on the lower side are going to be the financial institutions that don't necessarily have these kinds of tangible assets that are out there and expenses and overhead that manufacturers typically do. But this just gives you a quick snapshot of what is out there. And then just quickly, this is probably only affecting a handful of our members, but we've heard this from businesses. We know a few of you do this, where you have a business that you start up on the side purely either for R&D, some other experimental, or a targeted sliver of an industry on which you're focusing. This potentially may be an option, but you've got to explore it with your CPA. But for gross receipts of less than 5 million for companies less than 5 years old, or for some of you that are newer, there's an additional credit. They doubled the R&D credit there for small businesses from 250,000 that you can apply against your payroll taxes up to 500,000 now. So that's it. And currently for those companies that lack the income tax liability, take advantage of the full R&D. You can use that startup R&D for those purposes. That's something that folks might want to take a look at. And then again, we already kind of walked through the NOL loss limitation extension of what was done in 18 to 20 on suspension of CARES, and then ARPA, and that could potentially down the line, it's more for you CFOs and planning. But John, what increasing, I don't know what you're hearing in your talks, but in mine, I'm hearing we are going to have not just a tax extenders bill at the end of the year, but likely legislation that will have some significant tax policy in there for a number of reasons, including having a fix of the R&D tax credit. We almost got a 1-year patch in there last month that didn't make it in. No tax provisions of significant corporate interest did in the bill on which we were lobbying. So now we're looking at a year-end bill that my sense is we'll get at least a 2022 and a 2023 fix for R&D, just unsure if it goes much beyond that.
Well, where it might go beyond is there's a number of healthcare tax provisions that are set to expire as well. So this year-end tax bill is, to your point, is going to have some technical correction fixes to the bill that they just passed. It will include a 1 or 2 year fix of R&D. Are they going to fix EBITDA? But one critical controversy is going to be the inclusion of the child tax credit. Child tax credit expired on January 1 of 2022. This was a issue that most progressives, most Democrats were insisting to be included in the legislation. And I don't think moving forward at the zero tax bill, the Democrats will not go for any additional corporate tax relief over and above what was done in this bill until Republicans agree to include the child tax credit.
Yeah, okay, we've got 12:30. So, and I agree with you, John. I had a conversation with a very senior Senate staffer for a very senior Senate Democrat who said, hey, we love the R&D. We fight for the R&D every year, but we're not going to allow any of these things to go through until the child tax credit is addressed, similar to what was the case back in 2015 when we got bonus depreciation taken care of, that it was paired with the earned income tax credit. And they recognize how popular that the R&D tax credit is. And we're basically a victim of our own success in some ways, was literally what the staffer told us the other night. So that gives you a sense of where we are. But as we're here at 12:30, just in the next 6 or so minutes, let's just run through, and we've already covered quite a bit of what the CHIPS and Science Act did in the previous webinars. I think the last one was on July 23rd. You can always refer to that one for more in-depth details. But we just wanted to flag a few other items that we've already gone through. Creates a national supply chain database, looks at new manufacturing institutes. It looks at more money for funding for regional technology hubs, the R&D and workforce development programs, advanced manufacturing credit, similar to what we had mentioned on the other project on the climate change bill that's out there. And then, of course, there's additional grants that are going out there to partner with groups. The CHIPS Act also includes language that directs the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to seek out and to partner with trade associations that offer training programs and nonprofit industry organizations that offer training services. So they are directed to do that, and we will be in touch with some of that NIST that we know that used to work for Tim Ryan is over there these days, and work on that connection to make sure that they get the message that it's not just MEPs, that you really need to be focused, and working with the trade associations that really understand the issues. So we were able to get that provision in there and a few other areas. Same on national labs, John, and industrial grants. This is showing you that they really are trying to invest here domestically in reversing the offshoring trend.
Yep. And as it turns out, interestingly, as this bill was moving through, this next slide, which shows the searches for China have really increased. Now, is it because Congress was passing a CHIPS bill, which really goes after China and makes us more competitive against China? Or was it Nancy Pelosi's trip to China? But know that the American public's interest in what has been going on with China has been piqued.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's quite a bit on the plate right now. And then just lastly, before we turn it over to Bracewell here for an update on some of their activities and ours over at the International Trade Commission, just folks have asked us what was the impact of Pelosi's visit there? What do things look like with Taiwan and the dynamics? We need to keep in mind that President Xi's got his quote election or whatever they'll do in November, so he'll come in for a third term
election.
Yeah, well, it'll be a third term, a third 5-year term, and we'll kind of go from the next 5 years after that. And that's why, in many ways now, Biden's hesitant to lift tariffs on China ahead of an election in order to look weak and appeasing Beijing to make up for the visit. And at the same time, he doesn't want to now look like he has to be even tougher by imposing even additional tariffs, which he was considering. That could potentially inflame relations with Beijing at a time when inflation in the economy still isn't settled to the point that it needs to be. So it's kind of unclear to see what they're going to do. We still do believe at some point we will see additional moving of the tariffs around and also a new exclusion process to come out there. But we do still, as of the summer, do think that tariffs will remain in place there as well. But speaking of tariffs, I'll turn it over to folks over at Bracewell to give a quick overview of the activities of the last couple of weeks at the International Trade Commission, part of the government.
Yeah, July was a busy month. As we reported earlier, the International Trade Commission held a hearing in connection with an investigation that they were told to do by Congress regarding the economic impact of the Section 232 and 301 tariffs. We really focused on the 232 tariffs and the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users, which PMA and NTMA are members. I testified and we submitted comments, post hearing comments. that were due this week. You can find the testimony and the comments on the tariffsaretexas.org website under resources. If you'd like to see the full comments, we have the first page here. But we did conduct a survey, as we talked about, a quick survey of members to find out, to add some data on some of the replies that we made to commissioners who were asking about pass-through costs. Some of the highlights, and we had over 30 responses, which, we gave you about 3 or 4 days to respond. Some of the survey data that we included in this testimony is that 90% of the respondents reported at least a 10% increase in the cost of steel and aluminum. 67% reported an increase of greater than 25%. Almost half the respondents indicated they had lost sales because of this increased prices to cover rising costs. And 45% of respondents reported that their product was 11 to 25% more expensive, while 26% reported that the product was more than 25% more expensive than their foreign competitor. So it really was able to put it into context that these the steel tariffs are really doing nothing more. They haven't raised the production in the domestic production. They've really only allowed the U.S. domestic steel makers to raise their prices, which has put our members at a disadvantage. So thank you for participating. Now the ITC will go back and read all the comments, review the testimony over 3 days that were held back in July, and then write a report to Congress. And hopefully we'll at least get to the ITC to include some of the negative impacts of the tariffs and your participation, those of you on the call, both through the data that you provided and the qualitative data, reports that we get, as well as the quantitative data through these surveys, were greatly appreciated.
Yeah, no, they really were, and we do think it's going to help and move the needle.
Just a reminder that we do have a podcast, Talking with One Voice. So if you want more information on this, on these topics that we discussed today, give us a listen. We'll be putting up a new podcast pretty soon, I think in the next week. So take a listen. It's available on all the platforms that you get your podcasts. I listen to it on the Apple platform. You can also do it on Spotify as well, and a bunch of others.
I know we're running late. I just want to thank those who have made generous contributions to PMA's advocacy fund and NTMA's GAF fund. Those contributions, I'll make sure that the content that we're providing the members continues. So thank you very much for those who have already donated.
And thank you. Feel free to type in any questions that you may have here. In just a minute or so to the left, we do have one question that has come in that we'll go ahead and read and begin to start to answer a little bit here. If a question just came in, again, you can just type something into the right-hand box and we'll be able to get it into the queue here. Washington's always talking about batteries to replace or reduce gas consumption. Used batteries are toxic and disposal is going to be a problem. Is anyone talking about liquid natural gas or hydrogen fuel cells? Seem much more practical and environmentally friendly. A couple of things on that. Yes, again, if I had several $1 million sitting around, I'd be putting it in a hydro. The government is really targeting more of a 2035 range as well of those to be able to get those fuel cells more commercially viable in certain more ultimately retail oriented. The new climate bill does expand the credit for alternative fuel refueling infrastructure. That includes now also any fuel that is at least 85% hydrogen by volume, and giving it a base credit of 6% and then another bonus credit of 30% to apply up to expenses up to $100,000 for each pump that is installed as part of those incentives. Offline to the questioner, happy to talk through my personal thoughts on where you are on that, because I think we're in the same place in some ways. But that's a real question right there.
Omar, I'd also add that hydrogen is seen as a solution, particularly in the heavy truck industry, when it would. That's where I think the hydrogen and the mobility market really is going to make a difference because of the amount of batteries that you would need to put on to make a truck EV. Hydrogen seems to be a good solution for that, and that's where our focus is on the hydrogen production industry.
That's exactly right. So to that questioner's point, yes, there has been some considerations in there. Their semis seem to be moving in stages in some areas, but yeah, they are looking at low cost hydrogen in certain applications as well, including subsidized hydrogen. Are there any other questions? We're coming up at 12:40. Don't want to keep folks. Okay. Thank you very much. As always, feel free to reach out to NTMA or PMA and happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, enjoy the weekend. Thank you for joining us today.